So I'm Gabby Jelly-Askov, and I work at Platform as a Just Transition campaigner. And this is Ryan.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Ryan Morrison. I work as a Just Transition campaigner for Friends of the Earth Scotland.
Very excited to have all of you here. We're just doing a quick intro for the discussion between Jeremy and Terry on Crude Britannia. Maybe we'll give you guys both a moment to introduce yourselves. Terry, do you want to go first?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm a co-author with James Marriott of this book, Crude Britannia, Ours Shaped a Nation. I am by trade a journalist. I was the energy editor on The Guardian. I worked there for 20 years, and before that worked on a whole variety of papers. I was also a Labour councillor in Hackney between 1986 and 1990, so I was kind of done a bit of politics as well as writing.
Cool.
Jeremy Corbyn, Member of Parliament for Islington North, and very proud to be speaking this evening on behalf of the Project for Justice and Peace, which tries to give space, hope, opportunity, and above all, organisation to people on different campaigns in media, in environment, in economic justice, and international solidarity.
Cool, awesome. Thanks both. So basically, the reason why we're here is to talk for about 5 minutes before we get to the discussion about the book, about our campaign that we're currently running in the North Sea. Basically, we started working alongside Greenpeace in January 2020 to look at the energy transition and the conditions in the oil and gas industry. As climate organizations, we felt like we had a responsibility to consider what a managed phase out of fossil fuels means for impacted communities and the workers who work in them, and to ensure that we're campaigning for the social and economic changes that people want to see. Basically, we believe that staying within climate limits and delivering a just transition is impossible without a redistribution of wealth and power and workers and communities guiding the process. And so when COVID hit and we realized that we wouldn't be able to meet anyone in person for a long time, we decided to run a survey of offshore oil and gas workers to find out how the pandemic was affecting them and what they thought of the energy transition. We wound up surveying close to 1,500 offshore workers, which is roughly 5% of the workforce, and called hundreds of workers afterwards to have follow-up conversations and hear more about their lives and what they thought of the energy transition. The survey found that 81.7% of offshore workers would consider changing industries, and that over 50% were interested in retraining in renewables like decommissioning or offshore wind. And over 50, and I guess like a bit of a wake-up call for the climate movement was that over 91% of offshore workers had never heard of the term just transition, which has become quite a common term with the Scottish government. And so it really felt to us like whatever transition campaigning was happening wasn't hitting the workers that would be most impacted. Workers also rated their job security 1.8 out of 5 and told us repeated stories of poor treatment at work and breaches in health and safety standards on the rigs. So what we knew was a sort of boom and bust cycle of work in the oil and gas industry was sort of like confirmed by our conversations with workers. And yeah, I'll let Ryan continue on.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the particular questions we asked people was to tell us how, when they consider the energy transition, what would they say are the barriers? You know, what stops them? If there is a huge interest in moving industries, what's the barriers that hold them back? And one of the main ones that came through really clearly was that training requirements were. So if you wanted to work in oil and you wanted to work in wind, you were often expected to duplicate your existing training. And because of that precarious employment situation, that was often at your own expense. And so that was a major issue for people who are wanting to move between different sectors, that the opportunity of sort of seasonal or short-term contract work would come at a huge personal cost to you, when you might find it more consistent to work in one sector rather than the other. And largely those jobs at present were in oil and gas more so than they were offshore wind. But we're at a point where we need those offshore wind figures to rise at the same time as we need the jobs in the North Sea and oil and gas to decline, which means that we need to have that ability for workers to overlap, to move between more freely, recognizing that there's an incredibly large amount of skills and experience that would be vital in the renewable sector. So kind of taking the lead from what the workers were telling us, we did a bit more work to understand how we could standardize training, like what kind of solutions could there be including what we ended up coming up with, which was an offshore training passport. It was something to align and standardise the training requirements to work in energy, whether or not that was offshore and onshore, as far as possible, recognising that there might be some areas that require more sector-specific work. What we found then was we ran another survey. So we put another survey out to people to test that. We wanted to say, you told us training was an issue. You told us that you wanted more standardisation. Would this policy demand fit with what you think should happen? And we got 610 responses to that from offshore workers. Again, we asked more questions to understand a bit of the situation, including what were some of those workers paying, what were the costs involved, what was the general practice? Were you being asked by an employer to repeat training that might have been in date, for instance, which came through 65% of people told us that when they were applying for a new contract offshore, they were often being asked to repeat training that they already held at their own cost. And at the same time, when we asked them about the offshore training passport, we got a pretty emphatic 94% positive response rate. So we were able to very confidently walk away from that going, okay, brilliant. That is a worker-led demand for an energy transition that we can really push for. And so that's what we did. We followed up with meetings with politicians. We followed up with briefings for parliamentarians. We pushed the industry bodies. We pushed the trade bodies. And we tried to build as much as possible the worker voices into the press, into that story, making sure that it was them who led the story, them who led the conversation, and them who pointed out that this was an issue that wasn't being addressed. And I think generally where we are, as Gabby mentioned, is that this work is now an ongoing one. We want to keep doing that engagement. We want to build those relationships through one-to-one phone calls, through more test surveys, understanding what we as predominantly sort of climate-focused organisations can understand better, can articulate better in the demands that we make for an energy transition. Because what we appreciate and what we see around us is that it's whether or not it's a conversation about a phase out of oil and gas in line with climate limits, or whether or not it's a conversation about tackling the duplication of training and the burden that's placed directly onto the workers. What we're facing is a restricted industry, an industry that doesn't want to change itself, that wants to continue to have and kind of cake and eat it, wants to have everything set up in its interest, and a government that acquiesces, essentially, a government that's in the pocket or directed by industry. And that really where we are is understanding that if we're going to see a just transition, and that's a just transition in terms of how it meets climate limits, how it treats its workforce, and what impact it leaves, what legacy it leaves for communities in the northeast of Scotland, the northeast of England, then it's going to need to be led by and shaped by those voices. So part of our work now will be continuing on with those relationships, continuing to speak to people and making sure that as we make those demands, we're stood alongside the workers who have given us information, who've given us what their experience actually is, and making sure that we are standing side by side saying, you've got to listen, you've got to have these people around the table. It's no longer acceptable for you to say a just transition is shaped by essentially private business interests.
And so, yeah, with that sort of brief intro into our campaign, we're going to turn it over to Jeremy and Terry now so that they can talk about how oil has shaped the nation and what industry we are dealing with when we are looking at any sort of phase out or community and worker control. And I'm also going to share a special discount code in the chat for everyone in case you haven't already gotten the book. But while I do that, I will turn that back over to Jeremy and Terry. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you very much. And thank you for setting this up this evening. Terry, I've been studying the book, and it is a brilliant piece of writing because it puts so much of the oil industry into perspective, including the international geopolitical implications of British-owned oil companies. And I think it is an incredible piece of work. What made you want to write the book? And it ends actually in a fairly optimistic way in many perspectives. And do you feel that people as a whole have learnt from the oil industry, or are we going to repeat the same kind of mistakes in future polluting industries?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it ends on an optimistic note in the sense that it basically puts puts the issue into our hands. It puts the problem into our hands, and that is the situation. Nobody is going to solve this issue. Climate action, nobody being government, industry, or anyone else. The only people who will make this happen, and obviously we've absolutely got to happen. It's got to happen for our children's sake and future generations. We cannot leave this situation as it is, which effectively we've got to take responsibility for. People, particularly my age and privilege, we've had this carbon lifestyle that has led the planet into a very difficult place. So the optimism that is at the end of the book is really that it is in the hands of a wider movement and people on the ground to, get out of their houses, get on the streets, go to COP26 and really put pressure on ministers and industry to do something, because they won't do it of their own accord. They are short-termist companies, literally work on the basis of the next 3 months, pleasing the shareholders, keeping the share price up. They don't look ahead. They're completely unplanned in terms, or inappropriately organized for what was a long-term problem and is now a very short-term problem. Equally, ministers are concerned about what happens in the next 4 years in the electoral cycle. So the optimism comes from the people, and the kind of organisation that we saw come out of the Labour Party when you were leading it is the kind of mass party, mass organisation that we need to see. But I'm not optimistic about governments or industry at all sorting this problem out.
I thought the book covered a lot of ground. To me, the revelation, which will be to many people, is the part of the book relating to international geopolitics of the oil industry. The fact that Royal Dutch Shell and Shell in Britain both provided fuel for the World War II war effort on both sides. And so in a sense, Shell was fueling the planes, as you deftly put it in the book, for both the Luftwaffe and the RAF during the Battle of Britain. And then the way in which Britain's determination to develop a hydrocarbon-based economy through road traffic and development of that led to our very bad involvement in Iran and supporting the coup against the Mossadegh government in 1952. And then later, much later, because I remember campaigning in support of Biafra, was the Nigerian war, the Biafran war of the late 1960s, 1970s, when essentially Shell's disgraceful approach towards the Niger Delta and the pollution that went with it. And there's a line in the book, which I think is just so telling of attitudes, where you describe the above ground pipeline that went to Port Harcourt from the oil wells, which leaked and polluted the Niger Delta, killed the fish, killed the ground, and killed the livelihood of so many people. Contrast that with the below ground and more efficient pipeline that ran from Milford Haven to Llandasi, because they couldn't get away with that sort of thing in this country. One would hope not. I hope we wouldn't get away with it anywhere. I just think the international implications are so interesting in the way that you put it. And to me, that is an education in itself.
Well, that's very kind of you. You've read the book, Jeremy, and that's most uplifting, because I've been interviewed by a few people who quickly skimmed the book. But you've obviously sort of looked at it in depth. And yes, indeed, it's shocking. And a lot of this stuff is shocking to me. And I've written about the oil industry for nearly 30 years. And still writing this book, I was endlessly uncovering things that shocked and surprised me and appalled me. And on the subject of Nigeria, yes, listening to, I did an interview with Lazarus Tamana, who is now leader of the movement for the Ogoni people. They are the indigenous people of the Niger Delta. That's where the big oil industry in Nigeria is. And their environment has been badly despoiled. And the riches have either gone to Shell or to the Abuja government, and very little of it has gone to the Ogoni people. But they have had the whole impact. And Lazarus talks about his childhood, which you will have read, about how when he went to school, his parents were working and in the fields, and he got his own tea. And he got his own tea by catching fish in the waters around where he lived. When the oil industry arrived, not only did it arrive with white men driving large bulldozers, but when the oil industry arrived, there soon began to be massive oil spills, oil pipe breakages, and the area now, Lazarus still lives there. But when he opens his doors, he says his house stinks of oil, and the curtains are stained by oil. And so, as he said, we spoke to him quite recently since the book, and he's interested in people in the global north and Western Europe talking about the just transition, which is absolutely right. There has got to be a just transition. This cannot just be about climate action and not justice for the workers. But as he said, so Shell is talking about pulling out of the Niger Delta. What kind of justice is there for us? Will we be just left with this despoiled area? And, you know, like the oil workers themselves, there has been some financial benefits to people who can work in the industry, but and there has been some financial benefits seeped into the local economy in the Niger Delta, not that much. But equally, it's important now. They've become dependent on it to a certain extent. And so we talk about climate justice. We've got to, you know, what is the climate justice for the people in the global south who have had their areas despoiled? That's got to be taken into consideration as well.
And the point you make in the description of Shell arriving in the Niger Delta is that for the local community, the only need they had for oil was a bit of kerosene for lamps. They didn't have cars, they didn't have trucks, they didn't have central heating oil fired because they didn't need it. And yet they're the ones that have paid the price in short lives, in illness and pollution. But it's not the only place in the world where extractive industries have left a mess behind. Look at what's happening in West Papua. Look at the mess that's been left behind in Ecuador and many, many other countries as well. But what I liked about the book was also you transitioned that into the development of the big state investments in Britain on pipelines, on oil refineries, and on facilitating the work of the oil industry, but also the levels of pollution that went with it at Corytown, at many other places all around the country. And I just think that the book is so good at explaining the history of the oil industry in terms of our social history. But the other part which I found interesting was the finances behind it, the way in which Shell and BP, from being big conglomerates that owned lots of things, ran lots of things, were big employers and big investors in the communities where they were operating, gradually became hollowed out into a name where they just essentially farm things on to one company after another to carry the oil, to refine the oil, to distribute the oil, to sell the oil, to market the oil. And so we end up with sort of modern capitalism, which is essentially finance capitalism with no resources. And I think the way the book describes that, and then moving into how we deal with it through a green industrial revolution, because to me, that is the absolute key at the center of it all. How do we transition without damaging or destroying the economies? And that's where Rebecca Long Bailey came in. And when we first discussed the green industrial revolution, she was saying, as you've quoted in the book as well, that anything we put forward has got to be acceptable to people living in Salford on the basis that they're people that have grown up with polluting industries that at the same time gave them a level of security in their employment. And so we've got to transition and protect jobs and livelihoods at the same time.
Yes, absolutely correct. And I think when we started to look at the level of what is commonly called de-industrialization in terms of basically plant closures, plant sell-offs, as you described, both BP and Shell were involved in this massive retreat from Britain post the Second World War, and the social compact that Clement Attlee enforced. He nationalized many industries. He brought the trade union movement into the center of company organization or industry organization. The oil industry was given a kind of free pass. It wasn't nationalized. It fought very hard to avoid that. There was a government stake, a big government stake, more than 50% in BP. And BP, after the war, acted in this very sort of kindly way. When it built Corriton, it didn't just build the refinery, which we describe in the book. We go and visit it. We go and visit the social centre that was created there for the workers. Houses were built for the workers. There were all sorts of facilities that were given to them. This was a kind of paternal capitalism or estate capitalism, which you may have criticisms of it. But if you compare it with where we've gone to, where we heard earlier about the casualisation of the North Sea workers, you know, we've gone a very long way. I mean, as you also pointed out, there's a lot of BP and Shell have not only retreated out of refining, chemical making, etc. They've also retreated out of the North Sea itself. And while that may be the necessary trajectory, their reason for doing that was they couldn't make enough money in their view, and they sold off fields, and they're now owned by private equity-based companies or foreign state-owned oil companies from China or the Middle East. And when we're involved in campaigning for the oil industry to play its role in this transition, BP and Shell obviously get a lot of the focus, but the fact is that it's very hard to put pressure on Sinopec in China or INEOS, which is nominally a British company, but actually the chief executive, Jim Ratcliffe, wouldn't tell me where he lived or where the company was formally registered. And that's what you're dealing with. They don't have annual general meetings. They're not public companies. They're very hard to influence. So, yeah, the other thing that came out of this is looking at what has happened so far. We've had an offshore wind revolution, and I think that's true to call it so, and that Britain has been at the forefront of that, and it's been something greatly to be celebrated. But what can't be celebrated and is identified and detailed in the book is the fact that there's a lot of the same traits that were there with the oil industry are there with the companies that are building and investing in wind farms. I mean, the fact is that wind revolution has been built by foreign companies, and that's shameful, really, that Britain has played so little part because of the government's indifference, really, to whether there is any kind of British involvement. They're talking now, oh, we want 50% should be UK content, but this is you know, this is ridiculous. This should have happened when wind farms were originally started 20 years ago. It's been Danish pension funds, Californian pension funds, Ontario teachers' pension funds that have invested in these projects. It's been foreign operators largely that have done the work, and it's been a foreign supply chain. The London Array, the most famous offshore wind farm, was 93% foreign content. This is ridiculous. And there's a trade union problem inside the wind companies that needs to be addressed.
On the wind farm issue, the successive governments have simply not recognised the potential for wind generation or solar generation for that matter. The Tories then cut the feed-in tariff rate so that it became unsustainable to continue developing a solar panel industry. And as you say, importing pretty well all the parts for the wind turbines all around the country is absolutely ludicrous. So, for example, Fawley, former oil refinery, has become a place for assembling of wind turbine blades, the material for which is all imported from somewhere else. This could have been the spur for a massive industrial revolution all around this country. And you're quite right that the oil companies' behavior in essentially hollowing themselves out and handing things over to contractors is exactly the same thing we're doing with wind generation. I just find this thing a huge missed opportunity. But it's not too late, because there's going to be an increase in wind generation for sure. There's going to be a huge maintenance job to be done on existing wind farms, because obviously a wind farm in the North Sea has got some pretty heavy weather to deal with. They're going to need replacing all the time. There is an opportunity to do this, but the private sector isn't going to do it on its own. It's going to go where it can get the cheapest goods. And I remember talking to workers in Fife who wanted to make the wind turbines. They wanted to make them. And what they're doing is observing them being towed through the sea in order to be put up on the coast of Scotland, when they themselves have lost their jobs from a company that used to make these wind turbines. It's crazy.
Yes, it definitely is. And Liz Truss was in Scotland either today or yesterday, talking about, you know, a kind of Green New Deal in their terms, the Conservative government's terms. But there's still this sort of massive emphasis on the private sector. And, you know, it's a religion to the Tory party that the private sector has got to do everything, which is why we have £37 billion being wasted on track and trace through the private sector. You know, the state or public ownership has got a huge part to play. I mean, the countries who rebuilt their economies that we now admire after the Second World War, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and now China. These are China is arguably the most successful manufacturing country in the world. I mean, this didn't happen by chance. This wasn't left to the private sector to do. This was because there was a huge involvement of the state in planning economic policy, and there still is. I know the kind of ideas that you came up with for the last manifesto that Rebecca Long Bailey was involved with, you know, having a sort of national energy agency and national sort of climate banks, essentially. These are the kind of things that need to be done. It's interesting. I mean, I probably joined the Labour Party in the early 80s after seeing Tony Benn make a speech, and I'm sure you're you know, a fan of his political records. But in the book, it's fascinating to go through the history of him setting up the British National Oil Corporation, a state-owned body to take a role in the North Sea. Sadly, it was privatised by Thatcher. But he also argued for the setting up of a sovereign wealth fund. And during these interviews, I've asked that question of oil executives and people like Michael Heseltine. They haven't wanted to say so on the record, but privately it's absolutely clear. They now admit that a sovereign wealth fund should have been set up. And the Norwegian one, which was set up, is now worth $1 trillion. That's kind of money that could have been used for the kind of green revolution, you know, which does involve huge amounts of money. But equally, we've just discovered from COVID that this free market obsessed government can actually put its hands in its pockets and use the treasury to fund even workers' wages. And never mind sort of keeping industry rolling. So having established that is one advantage that's come out of COVID, and one thing that should give us hope, that the state has shown what an important role it can play in an emergency. And we're going through a COVID emergency, but the bigger emergency that is with us is the climate emergency, and that cannot be solved by the private sector. It's got to be solved by the state, and the state needs to start spending money to really implement that green revolution.
Dennis Skinner used to memorably say in Parliament when Margaret Thatcher was on about the ozone layer, he said, "You can't fix it with a man, a bike and an enterprise allowance. It can only be done by collective action." I remember talking to Tony Benn when he had stepped down from being a cabinet minister in 1970. He came to the Labour Party conference after the general election in 1970, which Labour lost. And he had been a minister in that government, Minister of Technology. And he described how he was trying to meet the global companies, global corporations, Shell, BP, Esso, Exxon, and so on. And he said they arrived at his office like visiting potentates who were telling me what to do as a democratically elected politician and minister. And so Tony spent the years from 1970 to 74, when he became a minister again, working out a very serious program of public enterprise, public investment, cooperative ownership in industry. And on setting up the British National Oil Corporation, he was keen for public ownership and, as you quite rightly say, a sovereign wealth fund. Thatcher came in 79, and instead of using the enormous income of resources, a windfall from the North Sea, what did she do? Cut taxes for the wealthiest, sell off all public assets at knockdown prices. And what resulted? An increase in the gap between the richest and the poorest, de-industrialization of the whole country, and we still are paying the price for that. So I think the points you make about funding the green industrial revolution is so important. A sovereign wealth fund would obviously be a very good way of doing it. We don't have one. And so it is about a green industrial revolution that does not threaten people's living standards at the current time. And so that is about guaranteeing income for all families. And so I personally think that we were absolutely on the right lines of the green industrial revolution that we put forward in the 2019 general election, and we'll continue campaigning on that. But let's move on a bit. Two things. One is, you point out that oil has been the big driver of wealth around the world of a small number of very, very powerful oil companies, and in their wake has led corruption, pollution, and much other things in the countries that have been affected. But we now have a sort of data revolution where the most powerful companies in the world, as you point out, are Google, Amazon, are Uber, and so on, who have almost no assets of their own by comparison to manufacturing industry, yet incredible power. So it is about democratic control and power, which I think your book shows how our political system has been corrupted by the power of oil companies, and the enormous wealth made out of it hasn't benefited either the people in the countries where the oil has been extracted from, or indeed the people in this country that have suffered the pollution from oil refineries and other things. It's all gone someplace else.
Mm. Well, I think one of the things that comes out of the book, or one of the things that we kind of found, was there's a kind of carbon consciousness, and that, I think, that's probably at the heart of what we discover, the danger that people cannot imagine anything different. Mark Fisher used to call capitalist realism. There is nobody can imagine a future, and part of the reason why people can't imagine a different, an electric economy, say, as opposed to a fossil fueled economy, is because the industry doesn't want us to. I mean, that's a key thing. And there is this, we look at the revolving door between, this massive revolving door between government and industry. And that it's like the fossil fuel is in our blood, in our imagination, and we can't think of anything differently. But your references to data, I mean, is interesting because, of course, the oil companies, they've got this residual power and mystique that we have to listen to what BP and Shell think about how the future economy should be built, what is credible and what is not credible in terms of renewables. And their view is entirely distorted by their legacy assets, that they don't want this industry to disappear. They've got all this money tied up in it, and so they need to slow the process down. So we need to be extremely, extremely wary about their ability to slow the process down. Always kind of, you've got to be realistic about how fast you can move. But the funny thing is, if it is funny, there's a company like BP's capital value on the stock market is £90 million. Facebook is 10 times that amount. So these oil companies are actually tiny now. We give them great sort of power for residual consciousness reasons, but actually they're quite small players. They really are. And it's worth saying that an issue that never really gets explored around renewables versus fossil fuels is fossil fuels are very dangerous. I mean, they're very dangerous for the workers, as Jake Malloy at RMT, the North Sea organizer, will tell you, because he's watched all these terrible injuries, and he's also been around when Piper Alpha exploded and 167 oil workers lost their lives. The Deepwater Horizon more recently blew up in the Gulf of Mexico. That has cost $60 billion to BP. It nearly destroyed the company. One well blowout nearly destroyed the company. It's worth saying that can't happen to a wind farm, because people never seem to sort of take any notice of that. So wind farms are not dangerous in the same way. Safety is much more assured. And in terms of, you would imagine the Tory government in particular would be concerned about national security. There is nothing better for national security than building renewable power, whether it's wind farms or solar, on our shores, or building the tidal array, which I was delighted when I talked to Mark Shorrock for the book, who was the promoter of it, that he talked to you and you got it, the tidal array, and he'd had such problems kind of interesting government in that. But
I had great conversations with him and others on the Swansea barrage idea. And as far as I was concerned, it was a win-win all round, because it would be clean, it would be sustainable, and that it would also help to benefit high-end engineering such as GEC in making the turbines that go with it. And I could see it as, yes, it would have been expensive, and I accepted that. But as far as I was concerned, it was an investment and a down payment for the future, because quite clearly there has to be a diversity of energy source. Otherwise, if the wind doesn't blow, you don't get electricity in wind farms. So you need hydro backup, wave power backup, and that's part of what it was about. And I just felt that this was a whole argument that we were winning on very, very well indeed. And your book has actually, I think, explained an awful lot of things very, very well. And also, I like the section you did about greenwash, the way in which oil companies have bizarrely decided they're going to be net zero by 2070. I've no idea where the 2070 date comes from, but it is, as you quite correctly pointed out, at least 40 years too late.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, since then, we've had a volte face by the oil companies, which is another thing that we should feel or gives us a sense of optimism. I mean, over the last 18 months with COVID, the oil price has collapsed. I mean, last year, the oil price actually hit zero. And that sort of massively affected not only their profits, but also shareholder sentiment around oil companies. And the reason why BP's share price is now sort of very much less than it used to be, and why they're only worth 90 million on the stock market is because shareholders have lost confidence in them, and they are pushing very hard for a kind of green agenda. And the oil companies have now brought forward all their targets for net zero. But, you know, it's unclear to me. I had a conversation with a very senior oil executive who, it was a private conversation, so I can't say who it was. I asked them why they got involved in renewable energy in the past and given it up. And he said to me, because these people were on a different planet. They were electrical engineers. We're petroleum engineers. We didn't understand it. It's a completely different culture. So now they're talking about Shell and BP, and others are talking about we'll be part of the electric economy. But I think there's huge problems for companies that are involved in a legacy industry that they totally understand, moving towards transitioning to something completely different. But the other point that is worth making in relation to zero oil prices is renewable energy does not based around commodity prices, and commodity prices that have raced up and down. I went to Aberdeen 10 years ago when there was an oil price crash, and the oil workers were using the food banks there. This is not an industry that has stability. It's used to complete instability. It goes up, it goes down, and that is not something that the renewable energy industry would be faced with. And I think that's an important point as well.
Well, the whole point about renewable energies is it's permanent. It's going to be there all the time. That's what renewable is obviously about. And I think that the changes necessary in the industry are huge. The point you make is a very good one about people that work in petroleum have great skills, incredible skills, and that should be recognized. But do we have an education system that really does give people a holistic view of the world? Do we have enough social studies in schools and universities? Do those students in universities studying chemistry, physics, engineering ever get involved in the social consequences of the industries they're going to be working in? Or is that something they just pick up along the way? I think we just need to think a bit more about education for environmental sustainability. And that should start in the schools as well as in the universities.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Sure, that's really, really important. It should start as early as possible. But I mean, judging from, if you go to any sort of climate action activity, XR or whatever, and we describe meeting Eva Luna or on the first day of the first XR protest outside Westminster, and she was 10 years old. And she talked and she spoke to everyone there, and I interviewed her afterwards with her mum, and she was throwing bits of grass around, and she was, very much like sort of, I remember my children when they were that kind of age, but she spoke with complete clarity and conviction about saving the planet. And I think that's very common when you talk to younger people, and they don't have to be 10 years old. They get it. It's instinctive to them, and they want a fairer, greener world. Unfortunately, the older generation, and largely the ones who control corporations and control governments, have, as I say, been brought up with this carbon consciousness, which makes it difficult, even if they haven't got a vested interest in keeping the whole thing going. They find it difficult in their imagination to think of this different world. But undoubtedly, we have to.
I've got enormous hopes of young people in this. I mean, I visit a lot of primary schools and so on. 20 years ago, you go to a primary school and ask them about the environment, and they'd look at you sort of a bit blank and wouldn't really know what you're talking about or why you're talking about it. And I now go to some primary schools where I say to them, what's happening with global warming, and they look at me a bit sad, like I don't understand, and explain the whole thing to me. And I think it's absolutely brilliant, the sense of consciousness amongst a lot of young people, and that fills me with a lot of hope. And so it is about understanding what the oil industry has done and indeed continues to do, but it's also understanding that in protecting the natural world and the environment, we don't run away from technology, we use technology, and we use information technology to help us in all these things. And so I just think that your book is incredible, and I hope you enjoyed writing it.
That's a whole other thing.
Well, come on, you must have enjoyed some of it.
I found it enormously difficult to write, actually. I'm someone who's used to writing 400-word news stories or a 1,500-word feature at most, and 130,000 words was pretty daunting, and no deadline really. So it took us 5 years. I thought it would take us about 18 months maximum. But of course, it was, it was very, very, as I say, I've worked most of my life as a journalist in this kind of field, and to be able to put all these things together in one place and to discover all sorts of other things about the industry and make it a kind of holistic story was hugely rewarding on a personal level, and hopefully people who read it will find it useful too. I mean, it is a kind of social history. You could see it as a travelogue. It's very person orientated, that's worth saying, but it's also kind of a climate action handbook, and you're kind of this is what you need to know about corporate power and the oil industry, and this is what you're up against. So I hope people do find it interesting.
Well, Terry, I want to say there's the book. Thank you very much for it all. And I feel for you on the writing of the book, because I often get invited to write articles. I've never understood where the magic figure of 800 words comes from, but people keep saying, yeah, write 800 words. I have no idea why it's always 800 words. And I can write 800 words very easily. Somebody says to me, write 5,000 words or 10,000. That's a wholly different kettle of fish altogether. So thanks very much for that. In the project, one of our 4 areas of campaigning is environment. The others are media, economic justice, and international solidarity. And we're part of the coalition of organizations organizing stuff around COP26. And obviously, we're all going to be there doing stuff, but COP26 isn't the be all and end all of it all. It is an opportunity, it's a moment, but it's also got to be one that we start talking about climate justice and justice for those people that have suffered so grievously. I'm thinking here of the Ogoni people, I'm thinking here of people in Ecuador, I'm thinking of people living in desperate poverty. And I think it was lovely the way you quoted Dylan Thomas's letters to his wife when he observed the poverty in Iran and the wealth being taken out of Iran by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation. And so I think your book is a great education to all of us.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I appreciate that.
Okay, we go back to now, Martin.